recording.
Well, that is fantastic. Thank you,
All right,
Kendall.
so
We're
now it
recording
says
now.
stop. All right.
Yeah, fantastic. We're recording now. This is being recorded, and you're going to get to watch it on the replay. If you are here live, please use the Q&A in the chat. If you're watching this on the replay, please use the comments down below, and we'll get back to you. So let's jump right in. So here's some slides. Today's presentation is how to plan and capture stellar Milky Way panoramas. Who am I? Who's this guy, you might say, if you've never met me before. My name is Matt Hill. I'm a photographer and an educator. I am a partner and educator at National Parks at Night. I've been a night photographer for over 35 years, since my teens. You do the math. I'm also a cut paper artist. And I worked in the photo industry for 25 plus years also. So I have both sides of the counter knowledge of products and people. And I am a Novoflex ambassador. I'm really proud of that. I love being associated with this brand because they make tools that make my professional life better. 3 of the properties that we have in National Parks at Night are our workshop program, National Parks at Night. There's also the Night Photo Summit, which is a virtual conference in the winter, usually late January, early February, and the Nightscaper Photo Conference, which happens in person every year and a half. Enough about that. Let's get into the topic. Milky Way panoramas are so fascinating. I think that in this day and age, when there's lots and lots of light pollution, that it's even more important to be able to see the Milky Way with your naked eye, if possible. For those of us that can't, there are cameras. The cameras can see more than we do. And when we point them towards that subject and we juxtapose it with the landscape, that's called astro landscape photography. Now, you could take a single picture and get some of it, and you could use a really wide lens and get more of it. But if you use panoramic techniques, you can get as much as you want. This is a vertorama, and this was photographed on Rapa Nui, otherwise known as Easter Island. And this is just a series of images that are made and stitched together, but together they look like one composition. They look like a single photograph, and that's the trick. Here's another iteration of my favorite kind of panorama, or one of my favorite kinds, which is called a spherical panorama. Tiny planets is how they're also called. This one has a meteor in it and the entire arc of the Milky Way, and a substantial amount of light pollution, too. This is another vertorama planned for. I knew that the core of the Milky Way would be coming up there, and I use a longer lens to make this vertorama to have the dust channels, the dust lanes of the core of the Milky Way align with the top of the ziggurat, which is in southern Colorado. And here's another example of getting the entire arc of the Milky Way into a photograph, but it's a spherical panorama inverted. So the inside's out. So instead of all of the sky being around a tiny planet, I inverted it so that I could play with those shapes, the concentric circles, and where they meet and how they echo each other. And I thought that was playful and fun and mysterious. And then you have a more traditional Milky Way panorama, but early in the season, and we'll talk about that, where the Milky Way is flat and low to the horizon. And it's closer to that light pollution, but it's easier to put it close to the landscape too, which is something that I find really attractive. A lot of people like to wait until it gets a little bit more of a bow in it, but I love this moment when it's flat and tight and across the horizon there. Let's talk about why panorama. There are certain benefits that panoramic techniques provide that allow us to do more, to be more, to have more possibility and potential. The first thing is pretty obvious, but it's worth talking about. I was going to say in detail, but that would be too much of a dad joke. When you make a panorama or a mosaic, you get more resolution than a single photograph. Now, you could buy a higher megapixel camera and all the things that come with that, either larger lenses that cost more money or larger file sizes, and get more resolution that way. Or you can use the camera that you have, and you can use panoramic techniques to get a larger final composition with greater pixel dimensions. For example, this single composition, if I shot it with one lens, with one frame on my Z6 II would be 6048 by 4024 pixels. As a mosaic final stitch altogether, it's 8649 by 9402 pixels. That's a lot more resolution. That's a lot more detail than a single photograph with the same camera. So you can use something that's familiar and create something with a higher megapixel, final megapixel count in your composition. My second favorite thing about panoramic techniques is being able to use perspective control as your final output. Here we see one single photograph, and I'm facing up a pretty aggressive incline here. So I put my tripod on this incline, and the incline's probably 20 degrees. And I had to tilt my camera back in order to not have only rocks in my scene and to get the Milky Way up there. And I took this picture, and see the pink arrows? They're tilting in, they're keystoning, right? When I approached the scene with a pano rig and I photographed it using panorama techniques, this is what happened. It looks more natural. And the trees, instead of tilting in because of the keystoning, are parallel. Wherever they grew parallel, wherever they're not parallel, it's not going to look straight. Of course, they're not man-made, right? They're kind of straight, but they're definitely straighter than the single image where I had to tip back. So this is one of my favorite things right there. It's just I can make images that look natural, that have less distracting elements, such as that tilting in. There's the final image without any distracting pink arrows. Now, Milky Way season in the Northern Hemisphere begins around April, May, could be a little bit earlier, and it runs through possibly November. And when we say Milky Way season, we're talking about the most popular part of the Milky Way, because it's always there, by the way. The core of the Milky Way being above the horizon. So this is not the core. This is a different part of the Milky Way. But as you get later into the season, further away from spring, the Milky Way doesn't really make that bow anymore. Or the Milky Way goes up, 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 and it ends up being around the zenith. Like if you took a dot on the top of your skull and pointed straight up, that's the zenith. It's the top of the imaginary sphere above our heads, right? That is our atmosphere. So when that happens, when the Milky Way gets so tall in the sky, one of the only ways to capture that faithfully without stretching the heck out of it is to use panoramic techniques. Here's an example of that. This is in Badlands, where I'll be in a few weeks. And at this time, the Milky Way bow made it up to the zenith. And a lot of people had trouble trying to make a photograph. Not me. I had a pano rig. And I said, I can do this. So I took enough pictures to cover this entire area and then some, and I was able to stitch them together. Here's another example. This one is at Yosemite, and this is the first time I've shown it this way. Here's all of the images that it took for me to make the next image, which I'm going to show you, which is the Panos stitch. But it took all of these to make that. And that was because the Milky Way bow was above my head. In fact, it was slightly behind it because I was shooting to the west instead of to the east because I wanted to get El Capitan in, which is why you see the core on the left-hand side instead of on the right-hand side, which for some people is like, whoa, that's cattywampus. Here it is, though. So I had 15 images wide, not always, as you can see from the previous image. Sometimes I didn't quite hit my mark at the beginning and the end, but 15 images wide by 4 rows, by 3 rows, right? The 4th row is all of these. If you look at the top, I didn't have to take as many pictures up top because the sphere comes in. So I just took 4 to make sure I had coverage over that. And also that I didn't always have like the vignetting at the edge of my lenses on there. So I made this pano by using a 24 millimeter lens, which was kind of bonkers. I could have used a wider lens, but I wanted to use a 24. And it was 52 images to make this single pano. But I got the whole Milky Way bow in over El Cap. And that was the achievement. That was the goal that I was going for. Another feature of panoramic techniques is you can get greater depth of field. Now, you can do this with a single objective, a single lens in a single direction too. You can focus stack, but you can focus stack for every panel that you have. You can take multiple shots at different focal distances. So this is, contrary to what you might believe, a panorama. It's a vertorama that's focus stacked. And here's the images. So along the left-hand column, you'll see each of those 3 frames that I shot for the landscape, there's 2 focus points, close and far. And then at the top, I waited for blue hour to be over. I waited for the Milky Way to come around and for the core to be an exact spot. And I did 20 star point stack images, and I used the averaging to make it look its best. Now, these days, I would just take a single image at a high ISO and use AI denoise. It's the same quality. But that's the tools that I had back then. And a great example of how technology drives the decisions that we make. When I put it all together, when I stitched the 3 images in the first column, and I blended that resulting pano with the top part that has the stars in it, the result is what you see on the right-hand side. And this is what I'm driving at when I say natural. You would not have guessed if I didn't tell you that that was using panoramic techniques to make that photograph. You might have said, hey, that's a single image, good job. And that's what I want. I don't want people to be distracted by the technique. I want them to enjoy the results. A wider field of view. Sometimes one lens is not wide enough, or look at this, like this is the Snake Mountain Range in Great Basin. The foreground is uninteresting, right? Even the mountains part is kind of uninteresting. I knew I was shooting this for an example at the time, and I had to HDR it because of the sun. So it was complicated to begin with because I was HDRing, and like I made this one picture, right? So here's that one picture, and a little bit of it is off to the right, but I'm going to show you what happens. Like, okay, so I shot a panorama getting the entire Snake Mountain Range, and behind it, you'll see that panorama up here, and here's a little opacity of them sort of juxtaposed over top of each other, a little perspective change I was trying. But that's the resulting pano, HDR pano, where I said, all right, the single image was 8244 by 5496 pixels, but the resulting pano was over 20,000 pixels wide and a little bit shorter, right? Much more detail. But I got the entire mountain range in. That was the goal. And I couldn't have done that with a single lens. Now, technically, you could have gone with a horizontal camera and taken 1, 2, 3 pictures and gotten the same thing, but I used a vertical camera, and it was 11 images, overlap 50%, 3 images per position, so that I can maintain the HDR. And I got a good range of contrast and definition in there. Here's another fun thing. You can use any focal length to make a panorama. You're not restricted to super wide or super long. Any focal length works. And if you know how to do the math, you can always overlap 50%. So it's also, as I point out here, it's less expensive than a shift lens, which is restricted to the focal length that you purchase it at. So anybody want to guess? I'm going to look in the chat. Anybody want to guess what focal length I used for the image at right? Queuing. And this is a 30-second delay. So I'm going to talk for a couple of seconds. When I went to Lofoten, Norway, which is where this is shot, I spent the morning shooting some examples to talk to people about Panos here. And I'm seeing some numbers come in here. And I had a lot of fun learning, even for myself as I set this demo up, why I would choose a different focal length for a different situation, right? So I learned a lot from it. And what I learned is that, like, sometimes, even if you have your longest focal length, it can make it look more natural. And here they are, all 4 images together, and we're getting closer to the answer. I see a lot of numbers in there, but none of them are the right number. You're all very smart people, though. It's a 200 millimeter, 4 images wide by 200 millimeters. And the results, using panoramic techniques, I didn't set out to make a panorama, although I was making pano examples. In this one, it looks like a standard 24 by 36 millimeter image. But it's shot with a 200 millimeter lens, and it's 4 images stitched together. Very natural. So I want to change your thinking about panoramas. They're not just for making wide images. They're for maximizing your opportunity to make the best images. So here's some of those other examples that I made. I was shooting through my focal lengths, and I recommend that everybody do this who's interested in employing panoramic techniques. There's the 24 up top, the 35, the 50, and the 70. You'll see once I got to 70 millimeters, I was cutting off the top of that mountain. It was very tall. So I would have had to go to a 2-row pano to get the top of that mountain in. I didn't. This is just an example set, right? But on the right-hand side, you'll see the perspective is there. It's the same for each of those images because I was on a pano rig, and every time I swept by, the relationship between that tree and what it was behind or in front of was exactly the same. So the distance between that mountain and that tree were always the same, no matter what focal length I used. There might have been a little bit of telephoto compression going on, but I was pretty far away from that tree. So the tree and the mountain behind it didn't change much as I did that. And that was one of the things I was looking to explore. It was just how many pixels were I throwing away on garbage, right? So the 24 millimeter, I would definitely crop off the bottom because that snow is uninteresting. At 35, it gets more interesting. At 50, it was just about perfect. So these are the things that we learn as we start to employ pano techniques. There are trade-offs to using longer focal lengths. On the pro side, of course, you get more resolution and more detail because you're taking more pictures, right? And you're punching in on that, right? There's less vignetting when you use longer lenses. They tend to have a better image circle, so they don't get as dark at the corners. Depends on how you stop down, right? And there's some compression that happens with those telephoto lenses. So if you want to make things look like they're closer together, you can get that effect with a telephoto. Now, on the negative side, the cons, there's less depth of field. So you got to be really careful to examine what you photograph to make sure that you're getting your closer subject and your further subjects in focus. And you can miss it. It's pretty easy. So always zoom in to 100% after you make those photographs and really study the close object and the far object and make sure they're sharp as a tack. There's also a greater chance of camera shake. And there's the age-old debate about whether you turn on VR or not, the vibration reduction. I've discovered that lately that sometimes I do turn it on and it works on a tripod, especially if the wind is blowing. So you're going to have to be careful to make sure the camera shake doesn't ruin your chances of stitching your panel. And also, as I mentioned before, you might have to use multiple rows to get enough coverage to stitch top to bottom all the things that you want to get in that final composition. So going wider, on the left, we have a 12 millimeter and a 15 millimeter. They look roughly the same, but there was a big difference between them when I shot them. I had my toes and my belly in one of the pictures, so that was fun. And then on the farther end, we have 135 millimeter and 200 millimeter. And I had to start to use focus stacking techniques once I went above a certain focal length because the depth of field gets so shallow at longer focal lengths. You'll have to pay attention to that. So for every panel that you have, you might have to tell your camera, which I can do with my Nikon, start here and end there, and shoot through all of those things so you can focus stack each panel and then stitch each focus stack panel together. Gets complicated, but we're talking about trying to achieve the highest image quality. Moving on to a nighttime image, right? This was shot with a 70 millimeter. And I just want to point out, I knew that the Milky Way was going to be soft behind it. And I did this on purpose. So this was a 2-row, multi-row pano mosaic. So there was 9 images wide on the bottom, 9 images row on the top, wide on the top. And I wanted to have only the hoodoo in focus so that would pop. Yeah, that is Bistai. And I love the moonlight coming in from the side, and I like being able to see the Milky Way behind it. And I just wanted something that was gentle as I was feeling wandering around the Bistai Badlands at night. Contrast that with this. This is a 12 millimeter from roughly the same position in one row, 7 images wide and stacked. And you can see that coming across from behind the hoodoo, or right at the edge of that wing at the beginning and across to the left, is the arc of the Milky Way. And here's another one where it's a 15 millimeter instead of a 12 millimeter. And I backed off a little bit, right? So there's the arc of the Milky Way again, and this beautiful moonlight, unfortunately, right behind me, kind of right behind me, and a little bit higher. So it's kind of flat lighting, but I was still seeing structure to the hoodoos. And it helps a lot to have these techniques. The final image was pretty banging. I like the quality of the image, and I like the qualities that it has. Let's move on to planning, because we got a lot of ground to cover. What apps do I use for planning at home and in the field? Well, here's a general overview. And again, this is being recorded. You can always rewind to the spot and take a look at it. But I use PhotoPills. I use my phone camera. I use Weather Underground, Windy for checking the weather, Clear Outside, and Astropheric for checking how clear the skies will be, and Stellarium for checking either remotely or on location roughly where some of these celestial objects will be. So let's look at this. Weather apps, here's some screenshots from left to right. You have Weather Underground first, which is, it's my go-to for basic information, right? And then next to that is a real step up, is the Windy app. And a lot of people really count on this the world around to get the best information they can about whether they're going to have weather that, too many weathers, not, if they're going to have good weather in their area. So as astro landscape photographers, it's especially important to us. Next to that is Clear Outside, which works in many places, and it's used more by astro photographers, not necessarily astro landscape, but it helps us astro landscape photographers understand what is possible. And you'll see the differently shaded blues there give you a percentage of cloud cover. So when it says 0, it's perfectly clear. And when it has a number in it, that's the percentage of cloud cover. 100 means total cloud cover, right? And then there's high, medium, and low clouds. So it's one way to gauge your possibilities about whether you're going to see enough sky to achieve your goals. And over on the far right is Astropheric, which is that on steroids. It's something that deep space object photographers, astronomers, either for observing or photographing, use to gauge their best chances of setting up to shoot a sequence for 8 or 12 hours at night to try and track an object and take pictures. It helps us astro landscape photographers greatly too. It also has the dew point in it and some other good stuff. So these are good apps to have in your pocket. Some of them are worth paying extra for, like Windy and Astropheric. I pay for them. I actually pay for Weather Underground too, but I also run workshops, and people count on me to know the most information I can. You decide what's worth it to you. And PhotoPills, for me, has the most useful tools in one place for photography planning. From left to right here, we have the Field of View app, which we'll talk about. That helps us determine what the total field of view is for the side-to-side motion or the up-to-down motion in a pano, and then we could take that number and cut it in half. The next one is depth of field, one of the hardest pills in PhotoPills to understand how to use, which is why I'm about to leave next week to head down to Big Bend to help Chris teach our PhotoPills boot camp. We spend a whole day teaching depth of field, but it's vital. And if you use the hyperfocal technique, it's very helpful at night. Moving on, the third one is the night AR, or augmented reality. This is a great way to find out where the beginning and the end of the Milky Way is going to be and at what time. You can do this on scene, or you can pretend you're there from the map view, from the planner view, right? And then the fourth one is spot stars. When we say NPF rule, this is the NPF rule. This is how you get the longest shutter speed you can use to get stars that are little points instead of baby star trails. Yes, there's another app out there called Planet Pro that has a lot of the same features. Choose the one that you like. I saw a comment about that. They're both great. I just happen to prefer PhotoPills. One of the other things that I've really become enchanted with is pre-visualizing a field of view. Since you can think panoramically, when I'm out physically scouting a location, I will pull my phone out and I will use it as a tool. On my phone, there is, mine has 3 lenses, right? Everybody's got a phone. Not everybody, most people have a phone that has a number of lenses on it, right? So each of those has a physical focal length. If you look in PhotoPills and you go down to focal length match, you can find out what the equivalent is. Now, granted, if you open up the camera app, you might also be presented with this information. Um, it depends on your phone. It depends on the app that you're using. But I'll show you how to get it with photo pills. What you do is up top, you choose your phone and the lens on your phone, and down bottom, you put the camera that you use. And then you'll see the focal length diagonal field of view down below. And that's what you can say, this is roughly equivalent to this focal length on my big camera, on my mirrorless camera or DSLR. So if you do this, in this case, when I had a 13 Pro Max, it was a 12 millimeter, a 25 millimeter, and a 77 millimeter. So I knew if I pulled out the Panorama camera app, that I could set it to one of those and have a rough equivalent to making a panorama with my big camera with that. So the 12 millimeter, I have a 12 millimeter lens. This is great. So I can make a pano sweep with that. And I have a simulacrum. I have a faked version of what it could look like with the big camera, and I could see the distortions and the perspective and how much top and bottom space I have for foreground and sky. Also works at the different focal lengths. So this is a 26. I'd say it's roughly a 24. The lens that I use the most for panoramas is 24 millimeters. So this is a natural view for me. And then the longer focal length, the 77, it's kind of like putting my 70 to 200 on at the low end, and I can see what that would look like. And I use the camera app with the panorama mode on as a scouting tool all the time. I also use these photos as location references, right? I just got to point out, when you get out there and it's dark, you think your brain's going to remember what it looks like, but having the photographs in your pocket is so helpful because nothing looks the same. You can also look at the photo metadata to see which focal length you shot it with, right? And then you can choose that similar focal length if you forgot, right? And if you're scouting light with your phone, you can also try different points of view. You can get down low, get high, get around a rock, move a little bit, look for those collisions of like an important foreground element with something in the background that you don't want touching or you want negative space around. Use your phone to do that in a more limber, fast fashion than picking up a tripod and moving it around and adjusting the legs. This will help you get to a decision faster and save you time later. And also, if you have location services enabled, when you take a photograph, it uses the GPS and it puts it in there so you can see exactly where you were standing, which is very helpful. So let's, for instance, on an iPhone, I look at a picture I shot. In this case, it was a pano, right? And then I swipe up on that image, and then it shows me both the focal length and on a map where I was. And if I tap on the map, it'll show me exactly where it was on the map. And if I click on show nearby photos, it'll show me the rest of the pictures I shot in that location, which is super helpful. So I recommend that you all steal this idea and use it if you aren't already. Moving on, there are astronomy visualizers that'll help you envision the arc of the Milky Way. In the Milky Way season, I'm putting that in quotes again, at the beginning of the arc of the Milky Way, you'll see Scorpius. Scorpius looks like sort of a bent T hanging down off of the horizon. Wherever Scorpius is, just add in an hour, you'll see the core there. So Scorpius goes up this way, right? And the Milky Way core comes up right there where Scorpius was. So you can use this as your first marker to say, all right, I'm on scene. If I see Scorpius, I know I've got about an hour before the core is above the horizon. It's also the beginning of the arc. At the other end of the arc is Cassiopeia. It looks like a W. So if you can learn those two constellations, you can kind of figure out without a phone how to know where your targets are for the beginning and the end of your pano sweep. And these are really helpful things. If you need help with that and you're not good at seeing constellations or asterisms, which are groupings of stars that look like constellations but aren't named constellations, then you can use an astronomy visualizer. So I have the name of this one here. I forgot what it is. I have to flip back. Silly me. There we go. Stellarium. There we go. So Stellarium is the one that I have on my phone that I love using. And it allows you to choose a different time and to move the hemisphere around to see where things are. And it'll help you figure out what things are, or you can point it towards what you're looking at in the sky and it'll help you identify it. On the right, you'll see photo pills in the night AR mode, which you can invoke from almost any pill. And that you can also sweep left to right, and you'll see the arc of the Milky Way change in front of you, and the time scale changes in the upper left-hand corner. These are very helpful tools to help you plan. Now let's talk about something fundamental. What's the difference between day and night panoramas? This is what I've learned. Capturing and processing daytime photos is comparatively easy. And I made this little chart for you. On the left, we have tasks. The next two columns are day and night. And then what changes at night? What's different? What's even more challenging or just different, right? So the first task is during the daytime, you can overlap probably 20 or 30% and get away with it. Why? Because there's so much data. There's a lot of brightness in the shadows. Compare it to night photography. And that contrast allows Panos stitching programs to say, oh, this and that are the same. I'm going to align them and stitch there. At night, the contrast is way down, less information in the shadows. So if you want your best chance of those two frames aligning and stitching, you should overlap 50%. Just the way it works. If you overlap a little bit more, that's great. You might be wasting your time, but 50% is very safe, right? It just means that you need to take more frames per Panos sweep than you would during the daytime. That's all. It's just time and effort. Next up, shutter speeds, right? In the daytime, they're fractions of a second. So you can actually cowboy that. You can be like, bang, 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 and stitch that. It'll work. At night, your exposures are going to be seconds long or minutes long. So you have to use a tripod, period. End of story. That longer acquisition time at night for a complete sweep means that for every minute you spend on each frame, if it's 11, it's going to take 11 minutes plus the time in transit in between to make sure nothing's shaking. So it might take you 12 to 15 minutes to make a sweep of 11 images that are 1 minute long. So think about that. And also vibration could happen. And you want to reduce that as much as possible or eliminate it if possible. Also, seeing where you're going to start and end. Well, honestly, during the daytime, you can just use your eyes. You can look and say, well, that's where I want to be. I'll go a little bit to the side of that and start there and end over there. And your eyes can see it because it's bright out, right? Or you can look at the scale on whatever you're using to rotate and see it because it's bright out. At night, you don't have that unless you turn on a flashlight. There's a disadvantage to turning on your flashlight. It's better to be night adjusted, to use a very, very dim flashlight that's very small and local, just to look at your camera settings rather than a big bright flashlight. Red headlamps are contentious because if you're shooting with other people, they spread out everywhere and they're very hard to get out of somebody's image. So if you have one frame where there's red on the bottom and the other two frames on either side don't have it, you can't recover from that. So I recommend not using red headlamps, even if you're shooting alone. Use white light because it's easier to deal with in post-processing. Anyway, if you don't turn on a light for 10 to 20 minutes at night, your eyes will adjust. So if you have to turn on a light to look at a scale, you're backing off on that and your ability to actually see what's happening at night. And that's kind of important to the entire experience and also to being present while you're making these pictures. You should be where you're at and not just make pictures. That's my opinion. So that's why I recommend click stops, because you don't have to turn your light on a whole bunch of times to see how much you're overlapping. You just click or click, click to the next one and you move on. It's also good for the people around you if you shoot with other people. Moving on to ISOs, you're going to use low ISOs during the daytime as long as your shutter speed's fast enough. If you're on a tripod, you'll probably use the lowest ISO you can, right? But at night, if you want star points, you're going to have to ramp your ISO up really high just to get them in there. And that means a short shutter speed, like seconds, and a high ISO. And that's where noise happens, right? That's why people use trackers for the stars, so they can get above 8 or 10 seconds or 30 if you're using like a fisheye. That way you can put a tracker on and have like a 30-second or 1 minute or 2 minute exposure of the stars and drop your ISO down. But there's a lot more effort required to use a tracker. It's totally possible and wonderful to do that, but yeah, So you have to put a lot of effort into making sure those stars look like points. More things that I've learned, they are harder. Making panos at night is harder than daytime, right? Just seeing what you're adjusting is tough, like we covered, right? The exposures are long and you can't see that landscape if you're shooting Milky Way stuff. I showed you a couple of images where there was some moonlight and you could still see the Milky Way. That's not typically what people think of, but I try and shoot under all conditions, right? At the bottom of it all, any feature that helps you repeatedly create accurate images in pano sweeps over and over is worth investing in. And having a really rigid system that can lock down and doesn't vibrate when it's locked down helps immensely because wind happens. And if the tool is easy to use, that means you can get out of the tool gets out of your way and you can focus on being creative, which isn't that why we got into this in the first place? Because we see ourselves as creative and we want to flex that creative muscle. So we should do it. And if you work on having your rig and your settings all worked out, let's say the no parallax point and how to set it up and calibrating everything, if you do that in the daylight, you're going to have more fun at night. So take those to the bank. I have sweated and cussed through all of them. Let's talk about gear for a moment. I will say it for the record, I can make a pano without any specialized capture hardware day or night. I can. I've learned a lot about it, right? But I have to point out, I'm more likely to make avoidable mistakes if I do it that way. You know, I'm also going to be more anxious and I'm probably not going to enjoy the process, which, as you could tell, that's important to me. I do this also because it's fun and I want to keep it that way. This was a cowboy pano. And what do I mean by cowboy pano? I was standing without a tripod, holding my camera away from the center of my body, and I went bang, 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 bang. And I took those pictures and I said, I hope that turns into a pano because I love this scene. And then I loaded them into PTGUI. PTGUI is how we say it. And it stitched. Huzzah! It worked, right? So you can cowboy panos, and you'll notice there's nothing close in the foreground, so there was no issues with parallax, with things being in different places as you sweep by. So it totally worked. Love the image. I cowboyed it. I admit it. I just want to let you know, you don't have to be always the most technical photographer ever. Do what it takes to get the shot. This light was changing. We had to get back in the van, et cetera, et cetera. I just cowboyed it and it worked, right? But I have to point out, for Milky Way panos, you are best served using a pano rig. Period. End of story. We already saw this, so I guess the slide's in two places. Sorry about that. It's still true. All of these things, will move on. So my favorite Novoflex pano rigs, and I've used lots of pano rigs from lots of manufacturers. The VR System Slim is my daily driver, so to speak. I've been using that the longest, and I use it with both my Z6, actually all three Z6, Z6 II, and Z8, and I use it with lenses up to 200 millimeters sometimes. So 70 to 200, even though it says 8 millimeters to 160, it folds up really small. It can disassemble, and it only weighs just about 1.5 pounds, 1.65 pounds, right? So as pano rigs go for wide to medium lenses, it's perfect. It's great. I've taken it around the world countless times. So yeah, I can't recommend it more. To the right of that is, if you have a heavier rig or if you want to use longer lenses, the VR Pro 2 HD will handle the heaviest full frame 35 millimeter cameras, and some medium format digital, depending on how heavy the lenses are, right? The difference is the base there has more click steps in it. So if you have a longer focal length, you can do click stepped overlaps. With the VR System Slim, it doesn't have those smaller increment clicks on the bottom. So if you want to do very long focal length panos, you're going to have to put it in stepless mode and just visually, or use the scale to do it. Otherwise, these are both incredible The VR Pro 2 HD is about twice as much weight. It's 3.7 pounds, but it is very, very rigid. So these two are fantastic. And when I say panorama rig, this is what I mean. You can calibrate these so that the camera is exactly centered, so that when you're rotating it around the center of the camera system. And you can also set the no parallax point, which we'll talk about later. Somebody just asked, Lawrence, I saw that, which tripod am I using for the VR Slim? For the VR System Slim, I'm using the Trio Balance. That's my daily driver with a quick release plate on the top. And for the VR Pro 2 HD, I either use my TrioPod M or I use my Pro 75. It depends on what I'm putting on top of it. If I'm using a really heavy system, I'll go straight to the Pro 75. Otherwise, the TrioPod M is extraordinary. It'll work perfectly. You can also use a three-way head or a ball head with a nodal rail. They also work, and we'll talk about the differences in a second, but here's an example. The new Kopf 2 geared head is really an excellent all-around great head. You can use it for lots of things, from technical macro work to landscape photography to making panoramas. So if you use it without a nodal rail, it's okay. I mean, not okay. It's fantastic. It's a great head. You won't have the ability to find the no parallax point without a nodal rail. But for most single row panos, fantastic. Once you add a nodal rail, you can start working with closer subjects. Then you can avoid the parallax. This is great for single row panos. You can make multi-row panos with it, but because it's not like a pano rig, like a gimbal, once you tilt back or forward, you're no longer in the no parallax point. So you just need to be careful about how close your closest subject is, and you'll still be very happy. If you wanted a one head solution, this is a great solution. You can also take some ball heads and invert them, turning them upside down, take the quick release clamp off of what was the top and then put it on what is the bottom, where the pano rotating base is. And then you can put a nodal rail on that, and then it turns it into a leveling head. So your rotation is above the leveling action, and then you can make great single row panos this way. So this is another way, if you have these solutions, you could do that. So that's what we see on the left there. On the right, it is a leveling head plus a pano base plus a nodal rail, and then the camera with an L bracket on its side. So there's a lot of ways to slice this loaf of bread and still get the results that you want. I still stand firm that pano rigs are superior, because click steps help in darkness, right? They help you preserve your night vision, and they're accurate. And the reliable start and stop positions, because of those click steps, make you can just go back to like 170 where you started and start your sweep again and never miss a panel if you're trying to align things that happen asynchronously. And you can also be ready anytime. If you start with good habits, if you only pull out the pano rig when it's like absolutely necessary and you use what you have the rest of the time, that's cool. It's great. But if you're always using your pano rig for most of this stuff, then you're always set up. You're already calibrated. You know your no parallax points. You're practiced. It just makes it easier to do it right every time. All right, let's talk about how to use the pano rigs. Here's some capture techniques, right? I'm going to start off with my guiding principle. I mentioned at the beginning, and I'm going to stress it again now. Panorama techniques are a tool in my tool belt. It's a method to help me capture and process a specific field of view that I found interesting. I walked up to this particular scene and I said, wow, tall slope. I want these bristlecone pines in there, but I want to have that sort of S-curve shape that's going on with the mountains. And I know the Milky Way is going to hit there in a little bit. So if I just tilt back, it's going to be too much open sky. It's not going to look right. So I said, I'm going to use pano techniques here. And that's what guided me to that decision. I also believe that whatever I can see, I can render it faithfully because I have pano techniques in my tool belt, right? So I can choose the quality and I can choose the field of view and know that it's going to look as natural as possible. When approaching this, think about this. Your pano frames, each of them, should have these qualities. And it might seem basic, but they're all true. They have to be sharp. They have to be in focus and edge to edge, corner to corner as much as possible, right? Not all lenses are made the same, but you should know your lenses. You'll know a lot more about your lenses by doing panos. It should be level, right? And there's a little asterisk there, Yeah, you can fix it in post, but if you are slightly off, you're going to be cropping the top and the bottom from the high point to the low point. So you're throwing away pixels that you could have kept if you had taken a little bit longer just to level it out, or have a system that could be leveled. You should overlap 50%, and that means side to side, right? If you're doing a panorama sweeping, or if you're doing a vertorama, that means top to bottom. The 50% overlap top to bottom for each of these. And if you're doing a mosaic, that means in both directions, side to side, this way, 50, 50, 50. And then for your next row, these should be 50% overlapping like this. So we'll look at that a little bit later. You're going to learn more about your lenses. You don't want to have unrecoverable vignetting. And I put another asterisk there. If you're using PT GUI, they're very good at eliminating vignetting when it's stitching your panos. Lightroom and Photoshop, not so much. They're not as good, and you have to use lens profiles more when you're processing in Photoshop and Lightroom. But we're not talking about post-processing during this presentation. I've made previous presentations, and Tim Cooper did too, on this very channel, talking about that process. I can answer questions at the end, but I'll probably just refer you to that video where it goes into much more depth. You need to be properly and consistently exposed. No auto exposure. You should be in manual, right? And you should have enough dynamic range. So if a single shot doesn't get you in the goalposts, like if you don't have your shadow data and your highlights data in one image, looking at the histogram, you're going to need to use HDR to get enough data in there to not clip. Here's some important steps, and I split it into 2 columns. If you're photographing star points, you're going to use high ISOs, 3200, 6400, 12.8, just because that's the nature of the beast. Your shutter speeds, you're going to use the MPF rule. You do not want to exceed the MPF rule shutter speed. Otherwise, your star points are going to turn into star trails, and they're going to look like mistakes. Your aperture should be fast. I typically shoot at 2.8. If I have a faster lens, I rarely open it up because the coma gets to be too much. But you can open it up really wide, and we'll talk about why a little bit later, if you need more stars. And sometimes you can have too many, but, figure it out. Yes. Lenner, you can turn it on, but instead I use AI denoise in Lightroom Classic. Switching over, if you're taking a photograph for your foreground in a pano, it's sort of reversed. You're going to use a lower ISO for higher quality. You don't have to. You can use the same settings that you use for the star points, and then they'll look the same. But I subscribe to a different feeling. The feeling is that if I can get higher quality, I will. And I'll try and get the best out of those 2 different sets of images that I can. So I shoot at a lower ISO, as low as I can, within reason. Like, I'm not going to take half an hour per panel, right? I might tolerate up to 4 minutes per panel if I'm not working on anything else that night. So that ISO is going to be low, and I'm going to match that with an appropriate shutter speed. I have to take a test shot. I need to look at the histogram, make sure that I'm not getting long exposure noise in the shadows, right? Your aperture, you could leave it at the same aperture that you used for the star points. However, you have an opportunity to stop down a little bit to get more of the landscape in focus. Do that if you can, if you have time. If you're doing star points after the landscape, don't forget to open up again and to refocus. And then Lenner, it can be on, but I use AI denoise in Lightroom Classic lately, or I shoot a separate dark frame with the cap on, and I subtract those in Photoshop. In photo pills, you can open up the pill that says spot stars, and this is how you get your NPF rule. Shutter speed. The difference between default and accurate is most people will never see the difference, especially on Instagram. If they pinch in, they probably won't see the difference between default and accurate. Accurate is, let's say you're having a gallery show. You should probably be shooting it accurate. What I usually do is I cheat in between them. I find the nearest whole value between default and accurate, and I use that. So in this case, it would be 10 seconds or 15 seconds, right? So that's for a 15 millimeter. And see what works. Sometimes you want a little bit more exposure, so you might go a little bit longer, but just keep watching for those spot stars. Now, coverage, how much should I overlap? We said 50%, right? Let's talk about what that means. I'll give you a little visual demonstration, right? In photo pills, this is how you figure it out. You go to the field of view pill, and then you enter your camera and focal length at the top, and then the first data point on the left. You make sure it's set to portrait mode if you're shooting a panorama. If you're shooting a vertorama and your camera is horizontal, just match it to your camera's orientation. And then the first row says horizontal field of view, angle of view, right? That number is the total degree from side to side of whatever orientation your camera's in. So in this case, we're vertical. So the short side of my sensor at 15 millimeters, is that 14 millimeters, is 80.97. So in this case, if I cut that in half, it's 40 degrees. So that's my target for when I'm making each pano sweep. Every position I want to turn 40 degrees, lock it down, and take another picture. 50% overlap, just like that. Now I'm going to visualize it for you. The rectangle is the entire sensor area, and that oval in the center is roughly what your Panos stitching software might use, which is really just the center of the lens. And this is why I say you might be able to ignore coma or chromatic aberration, because it generally happens at the corners and the sides, right? So if your stitching is only using the center portion of the lens, which is not guaranteed, but most of the time, then you're good, right? So this is what happens when you have 50% overlap. Each of those overlapping circles are adjacent images. So you have a lot of opportunity for the stitching software to say, these things are alike, and I'll stitch them together, and if they're high quality, right? So the red line here is you might crop the heck out of it when you're done. So we've got that too. If you're doing a mosaic, this is a 3-row mosaic. This is the overlap pattern you'll see. So yeah, there's a lot of redundant data, but it works in your favor here. And you might crop like that. So when I say you should overshoot it, I'm saying that you should leave room for the crop later. And then here's another mosaic example for you, right? So your final crop there. I recommend that you test all your focal lengths in daylight ahead of time by shooting through all of your focal lengths as a pano and then processing some panos with it. So you can get a feel for that, right? The chart that I have is going to be in the next screen, not at right. You should write down the coverage that you need in your notes. Don't worry about the corners. And then there's these charts here. I made a wheel on the right-hand side there so you can sort of see the difference between 22.5 degrees per click and 12 degrees. So that's what a rotator does, is it splits up a whole circle into a quantity of steps. And every time you click, 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 it's going to get that between them. On the bottom left-hand side here, you can see what the selector knob looks like on the VR System Slim. That blue arm is pointing at the number 48. So the rotator setting is at 48, and that's 7.5 degrees per click. So if you go up to the chart above, you'll see 48, 7.5 degrees. So if you do 2 clicks, that's 15 degrees. If you do 3 clicks, it's 22.5 degrees. And that's what we have at the top of that other example, is the rotator set to 48 with 3 clicks equals 22.5 degrees per. And that matches up with one of the lenses that I have. But if I set it to 36 instead, it's 10 degrees per click. If I set it to 30 instead, it's 12 degrees per click. And if I set it to 16, that's 22.5 degrees, which is the same as 3 clicks at 48. Isn't that cool? You've got a lot of flexibility here. So this chart right here, you could do your own math. It's pretty easy. You divide 360 by the rotator setting, and you'll get the degrees, right? But this is it. And this chart shows you how many things you're going to get or how many degrees you're going to get on coverage. This part doesn't matter as much now. It's just good to know that it exists. You can always rewind to it. And what I do is I extrapolate all of that mountain of data and I just put it into practical terms. This is a small chart that I keep in a note on my phone. These are all the focal lengths that I use regularly. And I have the focal length, the field of view, divided by 2, what rotator setting, and the number of clicks. So anytime I'm setting up for a pano, I choose my lens and I go to the last 2 columns. I set my rotator and I know how many clicks that I need to do per. And it's that easy. Once you've done the math and worked through it, which I recommend you doing instead of using a chart, then if you get a new lens, you know how to work it out. Or if you have a zoom lens and you want to use 43 millimeters instead of 24, you can figure it out using this method. And I talked about overshooting it. I'm going to stress it now. You should always shoot extra frames at the beginning and the end of your pano. Beyond 1 or 2 beyond on the left, 1 or 2 beyond on the right, and below and above, just in case, because you're going to want to crop it. Because every time you stitch, and I'll show you these examples, there's going to be scalloped edges, and you're going to have to crop those off. So, oh, here it is. So here's a shot at Joshua Tree. And you'll see the scalloped edges on the top and the bottom. I overshot it on purpose because I knew the end of the result was I wanted this. But I started with that because I knew that I was tilting back. I wasn't dead level and something was going to happen that I needed to crop. So I overshot it to get this end result. Briefly, let's talk about the no parallax point. Some people call it the nodal point. That is the incorrect definition of it. Not definition, name, label for it. Or entrance pupil is even more accurate. But the no parallax point is simply rotating around an imaginary point in your lens where things in front of your lens won't adjust out of the way as you pass by them. So if you've never done this exercise before, do it now. Hold your thumb out, close your left eye, put your thumb right in front of something. Now close your left eye and open your right eye and watch your thumb jump over to the left. That's parallax. So if you keep opening and closing your eyes, you'll see your thumb jump back and forth, and whatever's behind it becomes something different. Eliminating parallax is moving your camera forward and back on the pano rig or the nodal rail until when you rotate your camera, that object stays with whatever it's in front of, that it stays locked to that place further away, either the horizon or something closer. That's how you eliminate parallax. Why is it important? Well, if you don't do it and you really care about your foreground, you might have a really tough time stitching the images later. Because let's say this phone is in front of my face in one frame, but then you turn the camera and the phone's over here, half on my face. How's the stitching software going to know where to put the phone? That's the issue. So that's why we eliminate parallax when we're setting up for panorama photography. You should be aligned when there's foreground elements. If there's nothing, like this shot of me at the Grand Canyon, there's nothing in front of me. It doesn't matter. You don't have to adjust for parallax. I just do it out of habit because if there's something that needs to be there, I'm just in the habit of always setting up correctly, right? But keep in mind that it really depends on what focal length you're using and how close it is. Build yourself a note with all the information that you have, your no parallax point, your rotator setting, and how many clicks, or just how many degrees it is in between if you don't have a click step rotator. And now let's jump into coming into a landing here. We're going to look at some images on the way out. These are some blended landscape and sky examples. So why am I going to show you this? Because in astro landscape photography, sometimes the best landscape and the best sky don't happen at the same time. It might be that your best landscape is during twilight, and 2 hours later, the core of the Milky Way is up. That happens, right? So what do? Well, you set up so that you can accurately and repeatedly make a panorama with the same positions for the different panels at 2 different times. And that's what we're going to talk about here. This was across the little valley at the parking area at Arches, facing towards the north window and turret arch. And you can see them in the skyline down below. This is an untracked long focal length panorama where I got the core of the Milky Way rising over those iconic landforms. And this is the stitch, and I put it into PT GUI and I exported it with all of the extra space around it so that you can see this. And then here is the shot that I made before then during moonset. So we have this made, let's say, an hour and change later, and the moonset images, and they're aligned because I can do that in PT GUI, and because I started and ended roughly in the same place too, right? And then in Photoshop, I can select and mask and blend the two together so that it looked like they were shot at the same time. They were just shot in the same place at different times. Here's another example. This is at Mesa Verde National Park in Colorado. This is that low, tight, hugging Milky Way core that I love, just coming right across the tree line there. And then here, I shot this during blue hour because of the deep, deep, deep shadows over here at this cliff dwelling. And I knew that I needed some light in there, and I needed it to happen during twilight. Otherwise, there'd just be, I couldn't shoot this at night, and it would be disrespectful to try and light it up from across the canyon. So together, blended, they look like this. And I left all that negative space over on the right on purpose because I wanted you to feel what it was like to live under the stars in a cliff dwelling on a canyon. So I wanted that feeling of openness to the air from where you live, and also being amongst all those stars. But that came from two images shot at two different times and then blended together. This is Black Canyon of the Gunnison. This is, I believe, a tracked star image up top. And then we have shot almost during the same time under starlight, a little bit of moon, and then blended together. Not exactly the best image, but I brought this out as an example to just show you that shooting things at a different quality. I shot the lower image at a lower ISO and longer shutter speeds. And together, that way I got better, less muddy shadow detail in the beautiful cliffs at Black Canyon of Gunnison. And this is also Black Canyon. And you could see us working there, you know, and I wanted to get this sort of departing moonset light on the deep, deep canyon there. And then I separately shot the Milky Way bow. And then I was able to stitch them together later and crop off the other Michigas there too. So shooting them asynchronously and with an eye for the detail that was available at the time was the goal. And now I want to make one other point. If you make spherical panoramas, if you take a photograph of everything in every direction, you have sort of limitless possibility. Here's a standard projection of a spherical panorama where you can see the Milky Way is arcing over these landforms at Capitol Reef. This is the entrance to Capitol Gorge. So lots of air glow, lots of sky glow, and we've got the Milky Way and these beautiful rock formations. But if I render it differently, I can make it look like this. This is the same pano bracket of images, but I've got the Milky Way turning into a ring here. And then here's yet another way to interpret the same data. Because at this point, it's data, even though it's artistic data, right? So I just want to stress that if you use panoramic techniques, you're not limited to the photograph that you've made. You may be unlocking other creative, playful possibilities by having those options available to you. And that's it. We came into a landing. We talked about all the things that I wanted to talk about. We did it in about an hour, which is unusual for me. Whew. I'm going to pour some tea while I take a little check in here on the Q&A and take a look. So, all right. So first thing, I wanted to reiterate that Tim Farmer mentioned that he uses the app called Planet Pro. Yes, they have a dark sky map built in. That's fantastic. There's a lot of great options out there for looking at the the information that you need to know where you're at. I'd say explore every avenue that you can and use the data that helps you make great decisions. And thank you for calling that out, Tim. Let's see. Somebody else asked, what does the extra arm give you on the VR System Slim versus the VR Pro 2 HD? Boy, well, let's see. I'm going to open up the slide navigator here, and I'm going to try and find that comparison slide without flipping through all of them for you so that I can talk about this. And whoever asked that question, please pay attention now. So I don't see an extra arm here on the VR System Slim. They all have basically the same equipment. And I'm going to turn on the drawing here, and I'm going to sort of talk through it here so that I can help aid comprehension. At the bottom here, we have a rotator. This is where the click steps are, and that rotator is located here on both of them. And then you have an adjustment right here that's a clamp on the VR System Slim that also has a bubble level. This allows you to do your final leveling by looking straight down with the camera pointing down, but it also allows you to move in and out to adjust for different camera heights. One body might be taller than another. And let's say, like we're talking about this right here, right? Also, you might be putting the camera on its L bracket instead of on the bottom, like on the side, or you might be using a long lens that has a foot on it. So this adjustment right here allows you to expand or contract to make sure that the center of the lens is over the center of the bracket, right? And that's the same thing here, except that you're using this little clamp in the back for the VR Pro 2 HD. Now there's a lot of drawing on here. I'm going to get rid of that stuff. Then you have a vertical arm right here, which is the same on both. And this allows you to basically hold up the rest of the gimbal, the bracket, right? The difference is that on the VR Pro 2 HD, you can change this height if you wanted to. There's no real advantage to that. It's just flexible. You can disassemble everything on the VR Pro 2 HD. This right here is not disassemblable. I mean, you could do it, but it'd get messy on the VR System Slim. But also right here, you have the click steps for the Pro 2 HD, and the click steps are right here for your vertical axis. And on both of them, it's 10-degree steps. So whenever you want to change your overlap, you're going to find a detent there that goes click, click, click. The difference is that this knob over here is how you actuate it here by loosening it on the VR System Slim. On the Pro 2 HD, you have a lock knob around the back here, and then you have this little blue button that you depress here to unlock it to get to the click steps. And then finally, they each have this horizontal arm here, and the differences between them are that the one on the VR System Slim is captive. It's part of the unit, and it has a little locking knob here that allows you to slide the camera forward and back to achieve your no parallax point. That's what this arm is for. And this clamp right here is a quick release clamp. And you can turn that clamp from one orientation to the other perpendicular at 90 degrees. That allows you to, let's say, put a forward-facing foot for a long lens versus a perpendicular plate that's on an L bracket. So that's really nifty. It's built in. On the VR Pro 2 HD, you're provided with a blue quick release plate, and that has an anti-rotation set of pins on the back of it, and it has a screw on the bottom to screw your camera in to this. I usually accessorize that, and I put one of Novoflex's double quick release clamps on this, and that way I can put my camera on and off quickly. So I would buy one thing in addition to the VR Pro 2 HD that allows me to use it more quickly. But then it serves the same function. You can move your camera back and forth on this level arm here to achieve your no parallax point. And that's it. Bob's your uncle. They really operate the same. The difference would be the quantity of click step that you have, and you would actuate those through either this blue arm on the VR System Slim or this blue knob on the VR Pro 2 HD's panoramic base. Whew, that was a lot of talking. I hope that that helped you understand the differences between those two in greater detail. So the next question that I saw is, what is the MPF rule? I did cover this, but I'll say it again. I'll say a couple of different words. It was developed, I believe, by a French mathematician and photographer who said there's a better way to do this, because we used to use the 500 rule and then it became the 400 rule, which was kind of okay, but not adequate enough as resolutions became greater. It's simply stated the MPF rule is the maximum quantity of seconds you'll leave your shutter open before stars turn from points to little trails. And it's very important in astrophotography and astro landscape photography. It's something you should know and use all the time. And then Lynn said, not sure if I missed, how does the Pano rig solve the keystoning in Vertoramas? Oh, okay. So in this case, we're going to separate the answer into two things. And I'm going to switch over to this, and I might be able, I'm going to see if I can find a slide that'll match this. So we can put a Vertorama on screen. So there we go. There's a Vertorama right there. So how does it solve the keystoning? Well, there's no trees in here for me to talk about keystoning, but it still would exist here, right? The ziggurat would have tilted in if we didn't use that technique here. So essentially, you're taking a photograph facing down and then up a little more, and then up a little more, and then up a little more, and up a little more. The ones that are up and down, of course, are going to have the keystoning on them. So the capture doesn't solve it. Using the rig for capture makes sure that they can align properly. So capturing it correctly helps you solve it later in post-processing. What solves it is when you get into, and I'm going to say PT GUI is the best way to do this because there's greater options for projections. There's a trick in Lightroom where you just turn them 90 degrees and you say make a panorama and it works, but you only have two projections. You have 5, 6 more projections to play with in PT GUI. So what happens is you would choose a different projection in PT GUI that says inverse. And instead of being horizontal, it's vertical. That's the inverse part of it. And it will, as you move it around in the composition, and I'm going to refer to Tim's video now, you will be able to put the horizon line in the correct place, and the rest of the perspective should just pop into place because PT GUI knows what to do with that geometry, and it makes everything look correct. So I hope that helps you, Lynn. We teach workshops on panoramas. In fact, I'm going to Big Bend next, but right on the heels of that, I'm going up to South Dakota to teach with Tim our panorama intensive, and that's one of the things that we teach there. So what else have we got in the chat? Cool. All right, we're doing this, and I think we've gotten all the Q&A done. So if anybody else has any other questions, let me know. I'm going to take a sip of tea here. Oh, that's some good tea. I thank you for your time. I'll just reiterate that it's really pleasurable and enjoyable to present for you. I'm going to put this on screen so you can see our stuff. If you want to learn more about us and what we do, nationalparksatnight.com. I'll put that in the description of the video. We'll put it in the chat here. And you'll find nightphotosummit.com and nightscaper.com for our conferences. Thank you very much to Novoflex for making the finest camera support gear I've ever used in my life. You support me and what I do, literally and figuratively. So it's a pleasure to be able to contribute to your success. If anybody has any questions and you missed the live version of this, just drop them in the comments and we'll catch up to you and respond to you. Otherwise, I really appreciate everybody being here. Thanks for your time. And I really look forward to seeing you again. You guys are awesome. Thank you for tuning in. Until next time, we're doing these about once a month. We will check in with you again and let you know what the next one is. Have a wonderful day, and we look forward to seeing you next time. And Brenda, thanks for being there in the chat. And everybody else, happy shooting. Go out there and seize the night. Have a great day.